Well, did you get goosebumps? I'm sure they did. After all, it's not just a melody, it's a ringtone that was known in every corner of the planet in the early 2000s and which can safely be called the anthem of the noughties. Yes, this is the ringtone of the legendary Nokia phones. If you're a buzzer and you don't understand Nokia's legend, then here's a fact that clearly shows the greatness of this company. At the end of 2007, Nokia controlled 50% of the mobile phone market. That is, every second phone sold in the world was made by Nokia. By comparison, Apple has never had a market share of more than 30% in its history. And yet, no iPhone has ever been able to beat the Nokia 1120 record. This legendary phone, which many of us definitely had, is still the best-selling phone in history. In total, more than 250 million phones of this model have been sold worldwide. Now add to these achievements that Nokia has released the first SMS-enabled phone, the first 3G-enabled phone, the first phone with an internet browser, the first phone with NFC and full-fledged GPS, and even the first mobile game. And you get a global megacorporation that, at its peak in 2008, had revenue of over $50 billion, which was twice as much as Google's revenue in the same year. And then a logical question arises, where is this great corporation now? Why were all her achievements at a time when the best-selling car in Russia was not the Lada Granta, but the Ford Focus? Where the hell did Nokia go? And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. And today we will tell the incredible story of Nokia's ups and downs. Watch this video to the end and you will find out how Nokia turned from a toilet paper manufacturer into a global tech giant. Who's to blame for Nokia not making good phones anymore? Is it true that the collapse of the company could have been avoided? And most importantly, what's going on with Nokia right now? Spoiler alert, it seems Nokia is going to conquer the world again. Surprisingly, despite all its technological sophistication, Nokia is a company with a very long history. To make you understand how old this company is, Nokia was founded back in the days when Finland was part of the Russian Empire. By comparison, Nokia is a year older than Nestle, 20 years older than Coca-Cola, and more than a century older than tech giants like Intel, Microsoft, or Apple. At the same time, Nokia, like Coca-Cola, found its niche from the very first years of its existence and began to grow dramatically. On the contrary, the company was constantly changing and adapting, which helped to survive more than one serious crisis. For example, the crisis that occurred during the First World War. By 1914, Nokia was already a large company by Finnish standards. It was based on pulp and paper mills that produced paper, cardboard, packaging materials, and even toilet paper. The company also had several hydroelectric power plants that provided energy for its own production facilities and neighboring enterprises, but, of course, for money. And overall, things were going well. However, as is often the case, the war turned everything around. Paper trading with the main buyer of Germany and England has stopped, and demand for paper products has plummeted. This is how the company found itself on the verge of bankruptcy for the first time, but not for the last time in its history. One of the most influential Finnish entrepreneurs of the time, Edward Polon, became the savior of the company. His factory, which produced rubber boots, car tires, and other rubber products, flourished. After all, unlike paper, rubber was in great demand during the war. Therefore, having risen well on government orders, Polon bought out the unprofitable Nokia in 1918, and then also the country's largest cable manufacturer. So, step by step, he became the owner of a large industrial holding company. However, it is important to note that all of these companies, including Nokia itself, formerly remained independent legal entities, despite the fact that in fact they belonged to one person. Such is the fragmentation of business in Finnish. A full-fledged merger took place only in 1967, when the three main areas officially merged into Nokia Corporation. After that, the company began to grow even faster, and the next important step was the decision to actively invest in new technologies. By the early 70s, the company had established research departments that dealt with semiconductors and digital communications. Just think about it. Back then, Nokia was developing the technologies that have made Nvidia one of the richest companies in the world today. As a result, successful research in the field of electronics has led the company to a new stage of development. In the 70s, Nokia, together with the Finnish manufacturer of televisions and radios, Solora, created a joint venture, Mobira. Together, they first developed car radios, and then the first mobile phone. The work was so fruitful that in 1984, Nokia released one of the world's first portable phones, the Mira Talkman. However, it looked more like a suitcase with a special connection than a modern telephone. It was an almost 5-kilogram black box with a tube on a cord. As a result, by the mid-80s, Nokia was doing so well that it seemed that the company simply could not have serious problems. Just imagine, the annual turnover of the concern has already exceeded $4.7 billion at today's exchange rate, and the staff has reached as many as 45,000 people. But it was this rapid growth and scale of the business that caused the next major crisis in Nokia's history. The fact is that, in pursuit of profit, Nokia produced phones, cables, gas masks, computers, toilet paper, and even some components for air defense systems by the end of the 80s. And these are dozens of different businesses, each of which lived essentially its own life and required money and attention. They took out huge loans to finance all this. And in 1988, so many debts accumulated that the company could hardly cope with their payment. The situation worsened even more when Asian companies entered the European electronics market en masse. Because of this, Nokia began to suffer serious losses. And against this background, Nokia's CEO Kuri Kairoma, who personally tried to control the whole thing and at the same time keep it from collapse, he simply could not withstand such pressure. In December 1988, he was found dead in his office. The official reason was called suicide. Kairom's death instantly exposed all the internal problems of the company. Huge debts, dozens of disparate divisions, and a lack of a unified strategy. The new head of Sepur-Electa was faced with a choice: either gradually go bankrupt or abruptly get rid of everything superfluous. He chose the latter. And in a few years, Nokia sold the Nokia Tune tire factory, a paper mill, and non-core electronics divisions, and laid off almost a third of its employees, with all the remaining money directed to the only promising area. After the crisis of the late 80s, Nokia decided to completely restart itself and put everything on zero, that is, on mobile communication. And despite the fact that it was a risky move, it worked perfectly. However, the first mobile phones, as I said, were more like microwaves than miracles of engineering. Therefore, not everyone could believe that such machines would find wide application. For example, the Mira C-Man 900 weighed 760 grams and cost about 5,000 euros in terms of modern money. This is a little more than 200,000 rubles. That is, it is more expensive than the most flagship iPhone costs today. By the way, in Finland, this model was nicknamed Gorby because in 1989, a photo of Mikhail Gorbachev calling Moscow on this phone during a visit to Helsinki spread through the newspapers. But this machine weighed about 3 kilograms. And, by the way, it was also indirectly connected with Russia. It was using this model that the first mobile phone call in the history of Russia was made. In 1991, Anatoly Sobchak called his colleague, the mayor of Seattle, Norman Rice. But then the situation changed and the mobile phones began to decrease. Already in November of the 92nd year, Nokia released the world's first GSM phone, Nokia 1011. The phone got its name based on the launch date of November 10. As a result, it was this model with a retractable antenna that opened the way for mobile communications as we know it today. And then there was breakthrough after breakthrough. In 1994, the Nokia TNE Melody appeared, which, well, literally everyone knows today. Applause. In 1996, Nokia released the Model 9 Communicator, a phone with a full-fledged keyboard that could send faxes, emails, and access the internet. In fact, it was the first mass-produced smartphone that appeared many years before its competitors. In 1997, Nokia released the 6110, on which the Snake game appeared for the first time. In the 99th year, the Nokia 7110 model appeared. It was the first phone to support mobile internet via the WA protocol. A year later, the 3310 model entered the market, which became a commercial hit for the company and eventually gained legendary status. In the new millennium, the company did not even think about slowing down. In 2003, Nokia 6620 was released, which became the company's first smartphone to sell 1 million copies. The first, but, by the way, not the last. In the following years, millions of people around the world will be fans of Nokia N73 with a front-facing camera and 3G, Nokia 5130 Express Music, and, of course, the iconic Nokia N95 flagship of its time. That is, the period from the 90s to 2007 was the era of Nokia's triumph. For 15 years, this company has been the undisputed leader in the mobile phone market. Forbes magazine even published a cover story in one of its issues, asking if anyone could catch up with the king of phones, and as it turned out, he could. After all, ironically, in the same year, 2007, there was only one presentation that literally signed the death sentence of Nokia. On the 9th of January 2007, Steve Jobs presented the first iPhone to an illuminated audience. Against the background of familiar Nokia bricks, the iPhone looked like an alien from the future. It was slim, stylish, had an instantly responsive interface, and, most importantly, a touchscreen that no one had ever seen before. It was something, well, completely new at the time. And yet, smartphones were just beginning to gain momentum back then. Nokia had the perfect chance to adjust to the new reality and fight back, but everything didn't go according to plan. According to a large presentation by Nokia employees, which they put together immediately after the release of the first iPhone, Nokia did not perceive the iPhone as a real, serious threat. Yes, they recognize that touchscreens are the future, and we urgently need to implement this technology. Moreover, Nokia had already developed its first touchscreen phone 4 years before the iPhone's presentation, which, however, never entered the market. But at the same time, the company's engineers scoffed at the novelty. They argued that the iPhone was too expensive to manufacture and could not withstand the attack test. But, as history has shown, the overconfidence of Nokia's leadership did not allow them to see the revolution that was taking place right under their noses. It turned out that by the mid-noughties, people no longer just wanted a tenacious phone, but a beautiful, smart touchscreen device. Smartphones have changed the rules of the game forever, and Nokia has watched consumers fall in love with the next generation of phones. And not just iPhones. Soon, other players entered the market. For example, in 2008, HTC and Google released the T-Mobile G1, the first Android smartphone, and at the same time, Samsung released the Oni i900 with a custom widescreen display. Nokia, meanwhile, continued to produce push-button phones with sturdy housings. Their answer to the rapidly changing market was the Nokia N97. The company believed in this model so much that it proudly called it the iPhone killer. Unfortunately, the reality turned out to be different. The device was, well, to put it mildly, clumsy. The screen was tight, but the main problem was the Symbian operating system. Compared to Android and iOS, this system was a real disaster for third-party developers. It was complicated and inconvenient, so unlike iOS and Android, making an app for it was difficult and unprofitable. As a result, there were just over 50 apps in the N97 App Store at the start of sales, while the web store already had over 100,000. And, of course, the N97, well, became, to put it mildly, a failure, after which Nokia finally realized that radical changes were needed. In September 2010, Nokia had an event that no one could have imagined. For the first time in history, the campaign was led by a non-Finn. Stephen Elop, a Canadian, became the new CEO. A man who previously led a large Microsoft business unit. It was under him that Microsoft made a strong bet on cloud technologies and also brought Microsoft Office to record profits. For these successes, Elop was called an agent of change, and Nokia desperately needed such changes at that moment. However, no one knew how radical these changes would be. Elop began to act quickly. 6 months after his appointment, he called an emergency meeting of top management. Later, former employees will describe this day in detail in the book Operation EP. At a closed meeting, he unexpectedly attacked the company's own products and platforms with harsh criticism. He compared Nokia's situation to a man standing on a burning oil platform who has no choice but to jump into the icy water to save himself. The speech was supposed to motivate employees and make them move forward, but in practice, it turned out the opposite. Criticism quickly leaked to the press, and Nokia received a public scandal instead of a motivational speech. This dramatically damaged the company's reputation, shook investor confidence, and eventually brought down the sale. But it didn't seem to bother Elop. Moreover, it seems that this is exactly what he wanted, because the crisis gave him a carte blanche for radical reforms that were simply impossible without such a mess. In the following months, Elop played underhanded games and schemed against the chairman of the board of directors of the company, Jorma Ollila. As a result, in 2012, Ollila left his post, and in his place came a man who in fact brought EOP to the company of Rist Salosma. All this led to the fact that at the next meeting of the board of directors, Elop easily convinced the entire management of the company to completely abandon Scienbon, and most importantly, the other internal ecosystem of Nokia MiGo. But it was a really progressive system for that time. Nokia even released a smartphone based on this platform in 2011. It was a Nokia N9, and I must say that this phone was ahead of its time. For example, it had an AMOLED display, which the same iPhone only had in the 2017 Model X. Also, the Nokia N9 had no physical buttons on the front panel. Apple also came to this only 6 years later with the same iPhone X. So most importantly, MiGo, like Android, was built on Linux. That is, the system worked quickly and smoothly, and it would not be difficult for third-party developers to develop applications for this system. However, instead of developing his own promising platform, the startup criticized the design and stuffing of the N9 and insisted on switching to Windows Mobile. The stakes were huge, Elop's promises were beautiful, but the reality turned out to be cruel. While Nokia's labs were hastily creating new iPhone killers, financial losses were growing at an incredible rate. The loss in the second quarter of 2011 alone amounted to as much as $368 million. While a year earlier, the company had a profit of $227 million for the same period. But the company suffered these losses because these huge investments were for the long-awaited Nokia Lumia 800 and Lumia 710 based on Windows Phone. These phones were supposed to bring Nokia back to the top, but in the end they became monuments on her grave. By the way, it's funny that Lumia looked almost like the same Nokia N9, whose design had previously been criticized by the EP. As a result, during the existence of the Lumia line from November 2011 to April 2014, only 52 million devices were sold. For comparison, Samsung sold that much in just a couple of months. And looking back, we can safely say that these models were doomed to fail at the start. The Windows interface turned out to be too unusual and inconvenient. Phones didn't have enough memory, outdated single-core processors were used, and there wasn't even a front-facing camera, which was already the standard among competitors at that time. But the worst thing was something else. There were almost no normal applications for Windows, as the developers were not eager to create SFTS for this system. This is the most ironic thing, considering how much he has talked about the importance of ecosystem. Against the background of all these failures, it became increasingly clear that EL was still acting in the interests of Microsoft. After all, instead of saving the company, he just left. In 2014, Stephen Alp returned to Microsoft, taking with him key top managers in almost the entire Nokia mobile business. Microsoft has officially bought the company's mobile division for a ridiculous $7.2 billion, and Elo himself has been given a new leadership position inside Microsoft. As a result, Nokia's smartphone market share has collapsed from 50% to 3% under Elop's leadership. Nokia's total losses amounted to 5 billion euros. 40,000 employees lost their jobs, and the company itself was left without a mobile business and key executives. It seemed that the legendary brand had disappeared forever. But even despite such problems, it survived both in 1914 and in 1988. After Nokia's mobile business ended up in the hands of Microsoft, many thought it was the end. But Nokia has proven more than once that it always has a backup plan. The company, which started with paper, rubber boots, and cables, has once again managed to find a new foothold for itself. After the sale of the mobile division, Finns concentrated on what they had always been good at. These are telecommunication equipment and communication networks. And I must say that Nokia is still a powerful player in this niche. Today, the company is one of the world's largest manufacturers of equipment for 5G mobile networks. It actively competes with such giants as Huawei and Cisco, providing communications to millions of people around the world. But the most interesting thing is that Nokia smartphones still return to the market, though not directly. In 2016, former Nokia employees created a separate company, HMD Global, which bought out the rights to the Nokia brand and revived the legendary Android-based phones. And although, of course, the company no longer has its former market share, however, it has tried to reoccupy its niche by releasing several new phones. However, the main business of the company today is not smartphones. In 2020, Nokia began actively investing in future technologies. These are artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and even quantum computing. For example, the company recently announced that it is preparing to create the fastest and most secure 6G network by 2030. And although this goal sounds very ambitious, Nokia's history shows that Finns are able to rise even after the heaviest blows, so the legendary company has not disappeared anywhere. She is changing again, adapting and groping for new directions for growth. And who knows, maybe we'll see a triumphant comeback yet. After all, if there's one thing Nokia does best, it's come back from nowhere and surprise the whole world over and over again. That's it. See you in the next videos, and don't forget to subscribe.